Thank you very much. One of the things I found attractive about this book is the fact that it sets its own terms and is not an apologetic account. And this is actually saying a great deal because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, every day you see publication after publication, many of them very good and very worthy and very informative on various aspects of Islam, Muslim history, or society. But just as often these works are apologetic, though they may be, as I said, entirely correct in their historical accounts, and certainly they tend not to set their own terms of debate. Their terms of debate are set by others. So either, as you began, when you began your talk, either by rebutting what others have said about Islam, or by saying, actually, it's all right, we are all good friends, and there's a reconciliation possible. And I'm really greatly tired by these kinds of accounts, worthy though they might otherwise be. So it's actually very refreshing to have one like this before us. I just want to make three points that address various parts of this book. One of the things that really interested me, given its the time period which you deal with, it made me think of what little I know about the longer history of the Caliphate, which you also addressed in the beginning. And it made me think how interesting the Caliphate is as, in a way, part of the profane history of Islam, insofar as the post-prophetic phenomenon, right? From what little I know, it's mentioned in the Quran, say twice, once with regards to Adam and the other with regards to David, where it doesn't necessarily refer to a state. And of course, Muhammad is rarely, if ever, known as a caliph. So it has a post-prophetic existence, which I would like to argue allows it to be seen as part of Islam's profane history, if I might put it that way. That it can actually be thought of in terms of political philosophy, precisely for this reason. Right? And therefore it allows for a certain kind of development that other kinds of concepts might not. The other reason why I think it's part of the profane history of Islam is because, as you yourself show, the Islamist groups and movements of the classical kind, say Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, and Khomeini as the three big ones, tend to treat the Caliphate rather gingerly. And in the case of Maududi, whom I know a bit better, in a somewhat uncomfortable way in his book Khilafat or Mulukiyat, right, where he has to balance the Caliphate and kingship and say, well, he has to justify kingship in some way as well, right? Though noting that it is not the preferred mode of organizing authority, but he justifies it by saying, at the very least, this allows for the development of the clerical class, of ulama, which then sets a limit to the interference of, if you will, profane or secular power within the realm of religion. So the weighing and balancing act indicates, I think, his discomfort with the idea, though of course, as you note, it's a normative idea, he is by no means rejecting it, on the contrary. But there too you see the capacity that the idea of that the Caliphate has as a political idea of being developed. And it can be developed in various kinds of ways. Precisely as a profane idea, if you will, as I keep putting it, as a part of Islam's profane history, post-prophetic history. Now, if you think about Islamists like Maududi, right, for whom the model of the Islamic State is the Prophet's Medina, the Caliphate cannot belong to that model in many ways. It exists only after the Prophet dies. So this is one reason for the discomfort I feel but it's a very productive kind of discomfort. It's very, very interesting that the caliphate allows you to exit the ideal of Medina as the model for an Islamic state with the Prophet as its legislator. It does not belong, I would argue, within that model. It cannot belong within that model, and in that sense, it is also profane, and which is one reason why a figure like Maududi might not be so comfortable with it, even though he acknowledges its normative and historical status. But it also allows figures like Muhammad Iqbal, for instance, to develop the idea in different directions. And after it was abolished in 1924, Iqbal goes so far as to say, because he quite likes Mustafa Kemal Pasha in many ways, right? He disapproves of various things, but he will say, look, the Turkish National Assembly can be a caliphate. Why should the caliph be a person? He says, the Ataturk has decreed that prayers and the azan should be in Turkish. For a while, apparently they were. This is also all right. It's Islamically justifiable. So it's not as if he propounded these things himself. He just sought, perhaps in the way that theorists of the caliphate had in the past, to account for and to absorb these developments and to see how they might actually be recovered for the normative thought of Islam. But it led to these kinds of statements, which today we might see as being a bit out of the ordinary. And I would like to argue, with ending this first point there, that it is the post-prophetic, non-Medinan, profane character of the caliphate that allows it to be used in these kinds of ways, perhaps. The second point I would like to make is that, and again this emerges from your book, in what you were saying about how the issue of the caliphate was raised more by George W. Bush than by bin Laden and the company. That there has been, perhaps since the 19th century, this sort of conjoined movement, right, in which the discussion on the caliphate has involved the West, or Christianity, or Europe, as much as it has the East, or Islam, or Asia, right, Africa. And I don't mean by saying this that there was a nice friendly interaction. By conjoined, I mean also, it's a kind of coming together sometimes of a very hostile kind, right? But there's a pairing that goes on. And you see this very clearly in figures, a very pro-Muslim figure like Wilfred Scaven Blunt, the English writer who lived in the Middle East and who argued against empire, etc. Right? And he has this wonderful or wacky, depending on your view, theory about how the caliphate becomes important in the 18th and 19th centuries because of not just European inroads into the Muslim world, but specifically because of Napoleon's instrumentalization of it. Right? So he talks about, this is very interesting. So Napoleon's invasion of Egypt is seen by people like Edward Said as being the foundational moment for something called Orientalist discourse called Orientalism. Right? And for Blunt, Napoleon's invasion and his attempt to be seen as a Muslim, he seems to claim almost to, as it were, put himself forward as a rival or a possible caliph, and even convert to Islam. Blunt argues actually allows for the caliphate to become a new kind of model. Now, he may or may not be right on that, he probably isn't in many ways, but I'm just citing this text to show how these visions of the conjoined nature of Islam and Christianity, as far as the caliphate was concerned, conjoined on that subject, on that basis, have been written about for well over 100 years now. Right? Well before Mr. Bush goes on attributing the caliphate to bin Laden as a kind of modernized version of the evil empire that Reagan used to speak about when he spoke about the Soviet Union. There is something to it. Juan Cole, the latest scholar to write about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, also writes about Napoleon's attempts to fashion himself as an Islamic monarch, and in fact emphasized the role of Islam in religion over that of profane Muslim authority, right? The Mamluks, in his case. But you also see this in a place that I work mostly on, India or South Asia, where the British are very concerned about the pan-Islamism that is supposedly being fostered by the Ottomans, who blunt claims have copied just Napoleon, right, through Mehmet Ali. He has a nice genealogy of this. And are constantly, so during the mutiny of 1857, the great uprising against British rule in India, the English East India Company gets the Ottomans to issue apparently an edict, or the Shaykh al-Islam to issue a fatwa justifying British rule. So they are very concerned with the Caliphate, except the Indian Muslims who were fighting in the mutiny at the time seemed to have no interest in it. They were more interested in Persia. So, and there is work done on how this, their ways of thinking Islamically about the mutiny were grounded not only in the Mughal emperor, the figure of the Mughal emperor, who of course had a kind of semi-sacred status himself. He was also a peer. He was a murshid. He took disciples, right? But also to Persia and the role of Persia, the role Persia had traditionally played in supporting the Mughals. Right? So it's only well after that that the Indian Muslims come around to thinking of the Ottoman Empire in particular and the Caliphate. But this is not to disprove anything you've said, because even during the Mughal period in India, a city like Delhi would have been called Darul Khilafah, though of course there was no caliph. They did not acknowledge the Ottoman caliph, on the contrary, obviously. But the Mughal emperor did not claim to be caliph either. So you have this floating term. It's very interesting how Delhi can be Darul Khilafah, but the land or the house or the home of the caliphate, but there is no caliph. Right? So the normativity persists, as you argue, but the way in which the caliphate is seen historically changes a great deal. Right? It's just not present, or at least the Ottoman form is of no consequence until, I would argue, well after the mutiny. Thirdly and finally, and Salman has heard me talk about this before, I would like, and sticking with India for the moment, I would like to suggest that in a way the caliphate receives a really fundamental theorist in the figure of Mahatma Gandhi, who is the official leader of the Khilafat movement after the First World War, right? So the only place in the Muslim world, in the world, which really produces a massive movement in favor of the caliphate was British India. The man to whom all the Muslim divines turn, and whom they vest with the authority over this issue, though not religious authority obviously, is a Hindu, is Gandhi. And he actually does something very, very interesting, because he gives it a kind of social, ethical aspect, and not a political one. The political one already exists. You have various Muslim divines writing about it, and Gandhi does not presume to pronounce there. But I find it very, very interesting historically how you have the important Muslim leaders, like the heads of the great seminaries of Deoband, coming to Gandhi and pleading with him to take on the leadership of this movement. Right? And he does something, as I said, very, very interesting. He argues, and I'll say it very briefly, that the thing about the caliphate that makes it so important is not the geopolitics of it. That has its own role. But the fact that it disproves all the everyday principles by which pragmatic nation-state type politics are run, what you're referring to, right? So he says, look at this. Here are Indian Muslims. What are they gaining out of this? Nothing. They don't claim to be subjects of the Ottoman Caliph. They claim to be subjects of the British Emperor, right? King Emperor. What will their support of the Ottomans gain them? Nothing. In fact, it proves that the Indian Muslims are fighting for an ideal. That this is an example, the most supreme example of sacrifice for an ideal. It shows the reality of religion. It demonstrates that religion has its own reality. And because Indian Muslims can do this, they have idealized politics in India altogether. Right? This means that when their Hindu neighbors support them, their politics too can be idealized. Not because they believe in the caliphate, that's not the point. The point is they can sacrifice for their neighbors, just as their neighbors, Muslims, are sacrificing for, as it were, someone else. Right? And there are no material interests being espoused here. Now you might think this is just, Gandhi himself being idealistic. But the theory behind it is actually very interesting. He says there should not be a contractual relationship between Hindus and Muslims. Just as there cannot be one between Muslims and their religious ideal. Right? So when Muslim divines came to Gandhi and said, look, we will give up killing cows if you agree to support the caliphate, he said, no, I refuse this. This is not a deal. This is a religious issue. It cannot be part of a deal. It has to be fought on the basis of an ideal and by acts of sacrifice. Right? So if you are capable of sacrificing your time and money and effort for the caliphate in distant Turkey, then your Hindu neighbors will become capable of sacrificing for your ideal and therefore spiritualize the whole of politics. One can go into this, but I just wanted to point out here that this is actually crucial, right? Because this language is widespread during this period among Hindus and Muslims. And it allows one to think about Gandhi as a theorist of the caliphate, as an ethical form, not only a political one. I know you want me to...
Can you wrap it up in 5 minutes?
Yes, in 2 minutes. I want to end then by saying that Gandhi, by his acts, actually then himself becomes a curious model for Muslim leaders. Right? So the eminent Khilafatist and theorist of the caliphate, Abul Kalam Azad, known as Maulana Azad, wants to become a kind of Imam al-Hind, right? Like Gandhi. Gandhi gives him the model for Muslim leadership. And so does Maududi, who writes a book praising Gandhi, right, during this period. Later, of course, he rejects it. But one can see a lot of, as it were, Gandhianism in Maududi and the principles of the Jamaat-e-Islami that continue. So it's a mixed history, which is not to say it's not an Islamic history. But the development and the mixture of this history, which is run through and driven through by lines of force and coercion, is in a way rich, not in a way, is certainly very rich theoretically, and to return to my earliest point, is made possible by the post-prophetic or profane character of the caliphate. And I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Faisal. I think